The thunder rolled in from the hills, not as weather, but as hammer blows of steel. It was March of 1954, and the French garrison at Dien Bien Phu had just watched its main airfield disintegrate under Viet Minh artillery fire. The airstrip that was their only lifeline to Hanoi was now a graveyard of twisted steel planking and burning C-47s. Shells walked methodically across the camp, obliterating ammunition dumps and fuel depots in columns of black smoke. Men who had landed here 4 months earlier in confidence now crouched in trenches that shook with each impact. They were trapped. The heavy guns that killed the airfield had not appeared by accident. They had been dragged over 200 miles of mountain trails by tens of thousands of porters, dismantled and reassembled under jungle canopy. Each 105mm howitzer required 500 men to move it forward in a nocturnal parade that French reconnaissance aircraft never fully stopped. The Viet Minh had built an invisible road network out of human muscle and bamboo. Now those guns were dug into the surrounding ridgelines, firing downward at the entire valley floor with impunity. The garrison commander knew his stockpiles were measured in days, not weeks. The daily requirement of over 100 tons of supplies now had to come by parachute if the transports could survive the anti-aircraft fire. But the weather was closing in, and the parachutes were running out. And the enemy had planned for all of this. They had prepared their logistics for a siege that would last 60 days, while the French had assumed any attack would collapse after 5. But that catastrophe was still 3 years in the future. The road to that defeat began in the winter of 1951, when the Viet Minh's confidence first overflowed, and a different French general stood in their way. The sudden collapse of the French border posts along the Chinese frontier in late 1950 had intoxicated the Viet Minh High Command. General Vo Nguyen Giap now controlled most of northern Tonkin. His supply lines to Communist China were wide open, and Chinese weapons were flooding south in quantities that dwarfed anything the French could match. The chain of forts that had once guarded the frontier was gone, and in their place stood a confident, expanding army ready for the kill. Giap assembled 5 divisions around the perimeter of the Red River Delta. The 308th and 312th Divisions were poised west of the delta near Vinh. The 316th Division waited on the coast north of Haiphong. The 320th Division held positions south of the delta, and the 304th Division was held in reserve in the Viet Bac. It was a ring of steel that the general believed would finally crush the French presence in Tonkin. The target was the Red River Delta itself. This was the rice basket of northern Vietnam, the region that fed both the French Union forces and the civilian population that supported them. Giap needed that rice to feed his growing regular army. He needed the manpower that the densely populated delta could provide, and he believed that his newly formed Chu Luc divisions were ready for a direct confrontation with the French. But the French had not been idle. General Jean de Lattre de Tassigny had assumed command in December of 1950, inheriting a defensive system begun by his predecessor. De Lattre was a man of immense energy and tactical skill, widely regarded as the finest French soldier of his generation. He immediately set about strengthening the chain of fortified posts that protected the delta, and he poured American-supplied concrete and steel into what became known as the De Lattre Line. The De Lattre Line was not a single wall, but a string of over 600 mutually supporting strongpoints that enclosed a triangular area running from the coast north of Haiphong westward to Viet Tri and then southeast to Phat Diem. By midsummer 1951, the number of completed posts would double to over 1,200. Each post was a hardened position with interlocking fields of fire, designed to slow any Viet Minh advance and channel attackers into killing zones. De Lattre also reorganized his mobile forces, creating mechanized groups that could rush to any threatened point along the perimeter. He stressed the integration of air and ground operations, and he committed the first serious efforts to organize a Vietnamese national army. Most importantly, he opened the valves of American material aid, which would flow into Indochina in ever-increasing quantities. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test both sides to their limits. Giap struck first at Vinh Yên, a town at the northern tip of the delta only 30 miles northwest of Hanoi. On the evening of January 13th, 2 regiments of the 308th Division crossed the Red River and overran the small French outpost at Bao Chuc. They established themselves on the hills surrounding Vinh Yên, and by morning the French garrison was isolated. The operation was called Hoang Hoa Tham Ai, and it opened with stunning success. The next morning, Mobile Group 1 was ordered to clear the Viet Minh from Bao Chuk and restore the situation. The column of trucks and armored cars moved out from Vinh Yen in the grey dawn light. 4 miles from the town, the lead vehicles entered a narrow defile, and the jungle erupted with automatic weapons fire. The column was ambushed and cut to pieces, losing half its strength in the first few minutes of the engagement. The survivors abandoned their vehicles and fought their way back toward Vinh Yen on foot, covered by French artillery and airstrikes. By nightfall, the 312th Division had joined the 308th, and the two divisions had overrun most of the remaining outposts in the area. The French defenders were bottled up inside Vinh Yen itself, and a gap had opened in the De Latre line to the east. The road to Hanoi appeared to be open. What made the attack possible was not just the courage of the infantry, but the sheer mass of the logistical effort behind them. Over 180,000 porters had been mobilized for the assault on Vinh Yen. They worked 2 million man-hours, carrying on their backs and on bicycles over 5,000 tons of food, weapons, and ammunition. They moved at night over jungle trails that French aircraft could not find, and they kept the divisions supplied through the first critical days of the battle. The porters were the backbone of the Viet Minh logistical system. Each man carried about 40 pounds of rice or ammunition on a bamboo pole balanced across his shoulders. They marched in long columns that stretched for miles, moving silently through the darkness. When French aircraft appeared, they scattered into the undergrowth and lay still until the danger passed. They were slow, but they were unstoppable, and they kept the guns firing and the men fed. For a moment it seemed that Giap's gamble had paid off. The 308th and 312th Divisions held the high ground around Vinh Yen, and the gap to the east was open. French Mobile Group 1 had been shattered, and the survivors were fighting desperately to hold the town itself. But General de Latre was already airborne, flying into Vinh Yen to take personal command of the battle. He saw the situation for what it was, and he acted with the decisiveness that would mark his brief tenure. De Latre landed at the Vinh Yen airstrip under sporadic mortar fire and immediately began issuing orders. He called in every available aircraft in Indochina, ordering them to concentrate on the hills surrounding the town. He ordered the airlift of reinforcements from southern Indochina, stripping other theaters of their mobile reserves, and he gave the order to use napalm, the American-supplied incendiary weapon that would become the signature of French air power in this battle. The napalm arrived in steel canisters slung under the wings of F-8F Bearcat fighters. When the canisters tumbled end over end into the Viet Minh positions, they erupted in rivers of burning gel that flowed into trenches and bunkers. The hills around Vinh Yen turned into furnaces, and the Viet Minh infantry, who had no protection against this weapon, broke and ran. The survivors who tried to regroup were caught by strafing runs from the Bearcats and Hellcats. De Latre committed Mobile Group 3 to block the gap to the east that had opened on the first day of the battle. The group, hastily assembled from whatever units could be scraped together, moved into position and seized the key terrain features that commanded the approach routes. By the afternoon of January 15th, the gap was sealed, and the Viet Minh divisions found themselves facing a solid defensive line instead of an open road to Hanoi. The fighting continued for 2 more days, but the momentum had shifted decisively. The French air forces flew continuous sorties, dropping napalm and fragmentation bombs on the exposed Viet Minh infantry. The artillery at Vinh Yen fired shell after shell into the hills, and the American-supplied ammunition held out long enough to keep the guns in action. By January 17th, Giap had had enough, and he ordered a general withdrawal. The cost was staggering. The Viet Minh had committed 21 battalions to the battle. Between 1,500 and 6,000 of their men lay dead on the slopes around Vinh Yen. Another 500 were prisoners of war. The divisions that had marched so confidently into battle limped back to their base areas in the Viet Bac, their ranks thinned and their morale shaken. The battle had revealed a fundamental weakness in Giap's plan. The Viet Minh had almost no protection against French air power. Napalm had broken infantry attacks that could not be broken by machine gun fire alone. The Viet Minh artillery support had been inadequate, and the coordination between infantry and artillery was poor. And the logistical system, for all its heroic effort, had been stretched to its limits. But the French had their own problems. The cost of victory at Vinh Yen had been high in ammunition, particularly in the 105mm howitzer shells that were the backbone of their artillery support. The ammunition depots in Tonkin were nearly empty, and French supply lines from Europe were long and slow. Without the intervention of the United States, the victory at Vinh Yen could not have been sustained, and the French might have been forced to abandon the Delta. Brigadier General Francis Brink, the commander of the United States Military Assistance Advisory Group in Indochina, recognized the gravity of the situation. He flew to Tokyo and went directly to the headquarters of the United States Far East Command. He explained the crisis in blunt terms, and he asked for an emergency shipment of ammunition from American depots in Japan. The request was approved, and the shells were loaded onto cargo aircraft within hours. The American ammunition arrived in Tonkin just as the French stockpiles were reaching critical levels. Without it, the French artillery would have fallen silent, and the Viet Minh would have had the freedom to maneuver without fear of shellfire. The relationship between the United States and France in Indochina was complex and often fraught with tension. But at this moment, the American supply line kept the French in the war. Giap reviewed his failures in a meeting with his commanders on January 23. He admitted that the attacks had been poorly coordinated and that the artillery support had been insufficient. He criticized his troops for failing to push their frontal attacks with sufficient aggression against the French positions. But he reserved special praise for the civilian porters who had kept his divisions supplied, and he promised that the logistics system would be improved. But the porters could not solve the fundamental problem. The Viet Minh logistical system, for all its ingenuity and sacrifice, was not yet capable of supporting sustained conventional operations against a determined and well-supplied defender. The porters had moved 5,000 tons of supplies forward, but the divisions had consumed them faster than they could be replaced. The attack on Vinh Yen had outrun its supply lines, and the result was defeat. Giap did not have time to fully absorb these lessons before he was forced to act again. The French were too weak to follow up their victory with an offensive into the Viet Bac, but the Delta remained the strategic prize that the Viet Minh could not ignore. Giap decided to strike again, this time at the northern face of the French perimeter, aiming for the port of Haiphong and its critical connection to Hanoi. Operation Hoang Hoa Tham II opened on March 26 with an attack by the 316th Division on the mining town of Mau Khe. The town was defended by a single French-Vietnamese battalion, outnumbered 3-1. The Viet Minh infantry crashed into the perimeter in wave after wave, and the defenders were driven back to the pit head of the coal mine itself. The situation was desperate, and the defenders radioed for help. The pit head was held by a company of Tho tribesmen, commanded by a Vietnamese lieutenant, and 3 French non-commissioned officers. They fought with a stubbornness that surprised the Viet Minh attackers, holding the narrow entrance to the mine against repeated assaults. They lost over a quarter of their strength, but they did not break. And then the French parachute battalion arrived. The 2nd Foreign Legion parachute battalion dropped onto the battlefield in the middle of the fighting, a move that caught the Viet Minh off guard. The paras formed up on the drop zone and counterattacked into the flank of the 316th Division. The Viet Minh, who had been expecting a slow and predictable response from the French, found themselves facing a counterattack from an unexpected direction. French naval forces in the area also joined the fight. The gunboats of the Dinosaur, which had been patrolling the coast and rivers, steamed into range and opened fire with their heavy weapons. The combined fire of the naval guns, the French artillery, and the airborne troops was too much for the 316th Division to bear. Giap had underestimated the mobility of the French response, and once again his attack stalled. The Viet Minh lost 1,500 killed at Mau Khe and another 483 men captured. The 316th Division, which had been one of the elite formations of the Viet Minh army, was shattered. The survivors withdrew into the jungle, leaving their dead on the slopes of the mining town. It was a defeat that echoed the losses at Vinh Yen, and it confirmed that the French defensive system was working. But Giap was not yet ready to abandon his strategy. He had tried to break the French perimeter from the north, and he had failed. He had tried to cut the French off from Haiphong, and he had failed again. But he had one more card to play. He would strike at the southwestern corner of the Delta, where the French defenses were weakest and where the prize was the rice of the Catholic provinces. The operation was called Hanam Din, and it was aimed at the provinces of Hanam and Nam Dinh. These were the rice-rich Catholic regions that provided much of the food that kept the French Union forces in Tonkin supplied. If Giap could seize them, he would not only deny the French their food supply, but also gain access to the rice that his own armies desperately needed. The terrain favored the attacker. The southwestern face of the De Latre line followed the east bank of the Day River. The western bank, from which the Viet Minh would launch their assault, was dominated by a ridge of hills, honeycombed with caves that provided excellent cover and concealment. The Viet Minh could mass their forces unseen and strike across the river at a time of their choosing, but the Day River itself was a key terrain feature that favored the defender. It was navigable, which meant that the French dinosaurs could operate along its length. If the Viet Minh crossed the river, their supply lines would be vulnerable to interdiction by French riverine forces. The key to the battle would be whether the French could cut those supply lines before the Viet Minh could establish themselves on the east bank. Giap committed the 304th, 308th and 320th Divisions to the operation. The 312th Division was used to create a diversion at the northwestern corner of the Delta perimeter. The 42nd and 64th Independent Infantry Regiments were infiltrated into the Delta behind the French lines to attack rear installations and disrupt the movement of reinforcements. It was a complex plan that required careful coordination and precise timing. The logistical requirements of the operation were enormous. Moving 60 to 70,000 combat troops into position required weeks of preparation. The 308th Division had to be moved from Mao Khe all the way around the perimeter of the Delta to a point opposite Dien Bien, a distance of over 100 miles. The approach march was complicated by inadequate staff work and the refusal of local peasants to supply food to the column. The attack finally began on May 29th. The 304th Division crossed the Day River and routed the French outposts around Phu Li. The 308th Division overran the outposts at Dien Bien. The 320th Division crossed the river south of Dien Bien and began the main attack, destroying a number of small French posts. The French were taken by surprise, and for a moment the entire southwestern face of the De Latre line seemed to be collapsing. General De Latre responded with characteristic speed. Within 2 days, he had committed the equivalent of 2 divisions to the battle. 3 mobile groups, 4 artillery groups, an armored group, and a parachute infantry battalion converged on the Day River sector. The French air forces flew continuous sorties against the Viet Minh columns crossing the river, and the dinosaurs moved into position to interdict the supply lines. By June 1st, the battle had begun to turn against the Viet Minh. Giap had committed all of his forces simultaneously and had no reserves to exploit local successes. The 320th Division encountered unexpectedly strong resistance from the pro-French Catholic militia, which slowed its advance and gave the French time to bring up reinforcements. The 42nd and 64th Regiments, infiltrated into the Delta, were unable to block the French reinforcements in time. The Catholic militia fought with a ferocity that surprised both sides. These were local villagers who had been armed and organized by the French to defend their homes and churches. They knew the terrain intimately, and they refused to be intimidated by the regular Viet Minh infantry. Their resistance bought the French the precious hours needed to stabilize the line and launch a counteroffensive. The decisive factor was the French control of the Day River. The dinosaurs operating on the river cut the supply lines to the 3 Viet Minh divisions that had crossed to the east bank. Without food and ammunition, the Viet Minh attack ground to a halt. The 304th, 308th, and 320th Divisions were trapped on the wrong side of the river, and they were running out of everything. The climax of the battle came around the key post of Yen Khu Ha. The post changed hands several times in desperate hand-to-hand fighting, as the Viet Minh tried to break through the French line and the French fought to hold their position. By June 6th, it was clear that the French were in control. The Viet Minh supply lines had been cut, and the divisions on the east bank of the Day River were isolated. On June 10th, Giap ordered a withdrawal. The Viet Minh divisions fell back across the Day River under constant attack from French aircraft and artillery. By June 18th, the battle was over. It had been another costly defeat for the Viet Minh, another narrow victory for the French defenders of the Red River Delta. But the costs were mounting for both sides, and the strategic balance was shifting in ways that no one fully understood. The Viet Minh lost an estimated 10,000 men in the Day River campaign, including 1,000 taken prisoner. It was roughly 1/3 of the forces committed to the battle, and it represented a catastrophic loss of trained manpower that would take months to replace. Giap had made 2 major mistakes. He had failed to anticipate that the French would cut his supply lines across the Day River. and he had failed to anticipate the resistance of the Catholic militia. The failures of 1951 forced Giap to rethink his entire approach to the war. The dream of a short and decisive conventional campaign against the French had been shattered. The Viet Minh had lost over 20,000 of their best troops in the 3 battles for the Delta, and the Chu Luc divisions had been bled white. Intra-party recriminations followed the heavy losses. The scapegoat was the independent Southern commander Nguyen Binh, who conveniently died in a French patrol ambush while returning from a meeting in the Viet Bac, silencing Giap's internal critics. Giap was forced to revert to guerrilla tactics while he rebuilt his forces and reorganized his logistical system for a longer war. The French commander, General Jean de Lattre de Tassigny, had spent the summer of 1951 strengthening his hold on the Red River Delta. His fortified lines stood complete, and his mobile groups were ready. But de Lattre was not content to simply wait for the next Viet Minh attack. He wanted to seize the initiative and force Giap into a battle where French firepower could decide the outcome. The target he chose was the town of Hoa Binh, a key node on the Viet Minh supply corridor, linking their northern bases to the rice-rich provinces south of the Delta. On the morning of November 14th, 3 French parachute infantry battalions dropped onto the airfield at Hoa Binh. The Viet Minh garrison was caught off guard, and within 24 hours the town was in French hands. The operation was swift and nearly bloodless. But the real challenge lay ahead. Hoa Binh sat 45 miles west of the French defensive line, connected to it by a single winding road and a navigable river. Both routes were vulnerable to ambush. De Lattre ordered his engineers to clear Route Coloniale 6 and secure the Black River corridor. A column of 15 infantry battalions pushed along the road, reaching Hoa Binh in 2 days. Riverine forces moved up the Black River aboard landing craft, their decks crowded with ammunition and rations. The French established a chain of outposts along both lines of communication. It looked like a textbook occupation, but the Viet Minh were watching. General Giap had not been idle since his defeats earlier that year. He had pulled his battered divisions back into the Viet Bac and spent the summer rebuilding their strength. The French seizure of Hoa Binh gave him a new target. He understood that holding the town meant nothing if the roads and rivers leading to it could be cut. Giap ordered the 304th, 308th, and 312th Divisions to move into position around the French corridor. It took weeks to stock the forward depots and bring the units into place. Giap struck in early December. The 312th Division launched a human wave assault against the French outpost at Tu Vu on the west bank of the Black River. 2 Moroccan companies held the position, but the Viet Minh came in waves, and the defenders were overwhelmed. Tanks, artillery, and fortifications were destroyed. 400 Viet Minh lay dead on the slopes. The French had won a tactical defense, but the message was clear. Giap was not going to fight for Hoa Binh itself. He was going to starve it. The fighting at Tu Vu was only the beginning. Over the next weeks, the Viet Minh hammered the French outposts along the Black River one by one. The 312th Division and its supporting artillery pounded the fortifications with mortar fire and direct assault. Each outpost became a miniature siege, with the defenders fighting desperately until their ammunition ran low and the Viet Minh infantry swarmed the wire. The French riverine forces tried to keep the water route open, but every convoy had to run a gauntlet of concealed machine guns and mortars. The strain of the fighting began to tell on the French command. De Lattre had been diagnosed with cancer and was growing weaker. He was invalided home to France in late November, and command passed to his deputy. The loss of de Lattre was a blow to French morale. He had been the driving force behind the defense of the Delta, and his aggressive energy would be hard to replace. The man who took his place was Lieutenant General Raoul Salan. Salan inherited a worsening situation. The Viet Minh had not only cut the Black River supply line, but were also closing in on Route Coloniale 6. On January 12th, a Viet Minh ambush south of Notre Dame Rock sank 4 French patrol boats and 1 LSSL, effectively closing the river to further traffic. The survivors limped back downstream, their decks slick with blood. From that point on, Hoa Binh could only be supplied by air. The airfield at Hoa Binh was itself under threat. Viet Minh anti-aircraft guns on the surrounding hills made landings hazardous. Several transport planes were hit on approach or while parked on the runway. The garrison could hold out, but the daily tonnage of supplies arriving by air was a fraction of what was needed. Ammunition stocks dwindled. Rations were cut. The French battalions holding the outposts along the road were in even worse shape, fighting their own private battles while cut off from the main body. Giap kept the pressure on through January, rotating his divisions so that fresh troops were always in contact. The 304th Division harried the road outposts, while the 308th and 312th Divisions tightened the ring around Hoa Binh itself. The French tried to break the siege by launching a relief column down the road. It took 11 days to advance 25 miles, with every bridge destroyed and every bend in the road covered by Viet Minh machine guns. The relief effort bought time, but did not change the strategic equation. On January 11, 1952, General Jean de Lautrec de Tassigny died of cancer in Paris. His death marked the end of an era for the French Union forces in Indochina. He had been their most dynamic commander, a man who could rally troops and intimidate bureaucrats with equal force. His successors would struggle to match his energy and his grasp of the war. The news reached Tonkin within hours, and a pall settled over the French headquarters in Hanoi. Salan knew that holding Hoa Binh any longer would consume his remaining reserves without producing a decision. The Viet Minh had simply bypassed the town and continued using their north-south supply routes. The French had occupied Hoa Binh for over 3 months, but the strategic value of that occupation had evaporated. On February 22nd, Salan ordered the evacuation of the garrison. The operation was code-named Amaranth. The evacuation was a delicate maneuver. 20,000 men had to be pulled back along a single road while under enemy pressure. The plan called for leapfrog withdrawals, with one unit holding a key position while the others passed through. 200 trucks loaded with supplies and over 600 porters carrying equipment for the combat forces crossed the Black River aboard landing craft. The French destroyed 150 tons of supplies they could not carry. The column began its withdrawal at dawn on February 23rd. Viet Minh units struck at the rear guard almost immediately. The fighting along Route Coloniale 6 became a running battle, with tanks, artillery, and tactical aircraft all struggling to keep the road open. The French fired 30,000 rounds of artillery in 3 days. The riverine forces fought their own desperate action, punching their way downstream through ambush after ambush. The toll was heavy on both sides. When the last French units reached the safety of the De Latre line, the cost was counted. French casualties stood at about 1,500 men. Viet Minh losses were estimated at over 22,000. But the strategic result was a clear Viet Minh victory. The supply corridor between their northern bases and the southern delta had been interrupted for only a short time. They had built a bypass around Hoa Binh within weeks of the French occupation. The French had expended enormous resources for a temporary gain. The battle for Hoa Binh taught both sides important lessons. For the French, it demonstrated the enormous difficulty of supplying a major force at a distance from their fixed bases. Roads were vulnerable, rivers were ambush-prone, and air transport was inadequate for the scale required. The Viet Minh, by contrast, had shown that their porter-based logistics could sustain a multi-division operation for weeks at a time. They had also introduced a new tactical system, rotating units so that fresh troops replaced exhausted ones, allowing continuous pressure. Throughout the first half of 1952, the war settled into a pattern of guerrilla operations and small-scale raids. Giap kept his regular divisions in reserve, rebuilding their strength and stockpiling supplies. The French conducted pacification operations in the delta, trying to clear the Viet Minh guerrillas who had infiltrated behind the defensive line. Neither side was strong enough to deliver a decisive blow. The lull was temporary, and both commanders used it to prepare for the next round. The French position in northwestern Tonkin was held by a string of outposts guarding the Tay tribal region. The line was anchored by the town of Nha Lo Nha Lo, and it was supported by smaller posts at Gia Hoi, Van Yen, and elsewhere. The region was remote, difficult to supply, and largely denied to motor transport. The French relied on airdrops and light aircraft to keep the garrisons fed and armed. It was a fragile system, and Giap was studying it closely. In October, Giap judged that his forces were ready for a new offensive. He had 3 divisions positioned north of the Red River, the 308th, the 312th, and the 316th. Their objective was the Thai country, the mountainous region between the Red and Black Rivers. If the French outposts there could be destroyed, the road to Laos would be open. Giap planned to move fast, overwhelm the isolated garrisons before the French could react, and force Salan to fight on ground of his choosing. On the night of October 11th, the three Viet Minh divisions crossed the Red River on a 40-mile front. They moved in three columns. The 308th Division aimed straight for Neng Gia Lo. The 312th Division moved toward Gia Hoi on the right flank. The 316th Division advanced on Van Yen to the east. A screening force of the 148th Independent Regiment moved in a wide arc to the north to protect the offensive from interference. The columns marched through the night, carrying their supplies on their backs. Salan received reports of the crossing early on October 12th. He ordered the 6th Colonial Parachute Battalion to drop at Tu Le, northwest of Neng Gia Lo, to screen a planned withdrawal. The Paras landed in the hills and took up blocking positions, but the Viet Minh were already closing in. On October 17th, the 308th Division struck Neng Gia Lo. The garrison was battered by heavy mortar fire and then assaulted by massed infantry. The defense lasted less than an hour. 700 French Union soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured. The loss of Neng Gia Lo shattered the French line in the Thai country. The survivors fell back toward the Black River, with the 6th Colonial Parachute Battalion fighting a desperate rearguard action that cost it most of its strength. The Viet Minh pressed forward, capturing Gia Hoi and Van Yen in quick succession. The French rushed reinforcements to the region, but the distances were enormous, and only air transport could deliver troops in time. The 308th Division drove south, aiming for the Black River line. Salan responded by ordering a major offensive into the Viet Minh rear areas. Operation Lorraine was designed to force Giap to call off his Thai country offensive by threatening his supply bases in the Viet back. On October 28th, a force of 30,000 French Union troops, organized into 4 mobile groups and an airborne task force, began advancing north from the De Latre line. Their objective was the depot complex at Phu Don, a key node in the Viet Minh logistics network. The French advance was slow, the roads were narrow, bridges had been destroyed, and the Viet Minh had placed delaying forces at every defile. Engineers worked around the clock to repair the route, and the columns crawled forward at a pace measured in miles per day. The logistical demands of the operation were enormous. Each mobile group consumed fuel and ammunition at a rate that required constant resupply. The French had to establish forward depots and run convoys through territory that was never fully secure. On November 9th, the French launched a parachute assault on Phu Don. 3 battalions of the 1st Airborne Task Force dropped onto the zone north of the Che River. The jump was unopposed, and the Paras linked up with riverine forces moving up the river before securing a bridgehead. By late afternoon, they had linked up with the armored column advancing from the south. The depot complex was in French hands, but the prize was smaller than expected. The Viet Minh had been warned of the French advance. Much of the materiel stored at Phu Don had already been moved to safer locations deeper in the Viet back. The French discovered the remaining depots and began destroying the contents. They captured over 150 tons of munitions, explosives, and equipment. They found 3 Soviet-made Molotov trucks, a sign of the growing Chinese aid. They also found thousands of grenades, mortar rounds, and rifle cartridges. It was a substantial haul, but it was not decisive. The destruction of the Phu Don depots was a tactical success, but Giap refused to take the bait. He did not pull his divisions back from the Ta country to defend his supply bases. He had anticipated that the French might try such a move and had left the 176th Regiment and the 36th Regiment to guard his rear areas. Those units fought delaying actions along Route Coloniale 2, buying time for the main body to continue its offensive. Giap understood that the war would not be decided by depots. It would be decided by the destruction of armies. The French advance continued north of Phu Doan toward the town of Phu Hien. The armored columns clanked up Route Coloniale 2, past burned-out villages and abandoned Viet Minh positions. On November 13th, the lead elements reached Phu Hien, nearly 100 miles from the De Latre line. Blocking forces were positioned astride the roads leading to Yen Bay and Tu Yen Quang, the main Viet Minh logistical centers. But Salan hesitated. He did not have the reserves to take and hold those towns. The French logistical tail was stretched to the breaking point. On November 14th, Salan decided to end Operation Lorraine. The withdrawal began immediately. The French columns turned around and started the long march south. Giap ordered the 36th Regiment to pursue and harass the retreating columns. On November 17th, the Viet Minh sprang an ambush at the Chan Muong Pass. The kill zone was over half a mile long, and the French column was caught in defile. The fighting was savage and hand-to-hand. The 36th Regiment pressed the attack through the afternoon and into the night. The French lost 1 tank, 6 half-tracks, and 2 jeeps in the Chan Muong Pass. But they managed to break through the ambush and continue their withdrawal. The rear guard was under constant pressure, and the Viet Minh attacked again on the night of November 23rd, overrunning 1 French unit before being driven back. The last elements crossed into the De Latre line on November 26th. Operation Lorraine was over. The French had destroyed some Viet Minh supplies, but the main enemy force in the Tay country had not been diverted. While the French were conducting Operation Lorraine, Giap continued his Tay country offensive. The 308th Division had reached the Black River line and was preparing to assault the French strongpoints. The main defensive position was at Nha San, an open plateau held by a garrison that was being rapidly reinforced by air. The French had learned from Hoa Binh that outposts needed strong defenses and ample stocks. Nha San was being built into a fortress, with artillery positions, barbed wire, and cleared fields of fire. The first Viet Minh assault on Nha San came on November 23rd. The 308th Division launched a frontal attack across the open ground, expecting to overwhelm the defenders by weight of numbers. The French artillery and mortars tore gaps in the Viet Minh ranks. Machine guns swept the approaches. The assault was broken with heavy losses. Giap had underestimated the strength of the French position and the firepower his troops would face in the open. The attack was repulsed, and the 308th Division fell back to regroup. Giap was not ready to give up. He ordered a second assault, this time better prepared and supported by more artillery. The night of November 30th saw the 308th Division launch a series of human wave attacks against the French perimeter. The fighting was intense, with Viet Minh infantry pressing forward through the wire and into the French positions. The defense held, but the cost was high on both sides. The Viet Minh suffered enormous losses, with estimates placing their casualties at over 7,000 for the entire Nha San campaign. The French garrison at Nha San held out through December. The airfield remained open, and supplies were flown in daily. The camp was a fully functioning airhead, with artillery, armor, and infantry all integrated into a tight defensive perimeter. The Viet Minh siege was ineffective. They could not breach the wire, and their artillery was insufficient to suppress the French guns. Nha San became a showpiece of the French hedgehog concept, a base that could be held against massed infantry assault as long as the air supply held. But Nha San also tied down a large portion of the French mobile reserve. The garrison required 12,000 men, and the airlift needed to supply them consumed a major share of the available transport aircraft. The camp could not block the Viet Minh from bypassing it and continuing into Laos. It was a fortress that did not dominate the surrounding territory. The French had proved they could hold a hedgehog, but they had not proved that holding one was strategically useful. By the end of 1952, the strategic situation had shifted. The French had demonstrated the limits of their logistical reach. Operation Lorraine had shown that they could penetrate the Viet back and destroy supplies, but they could not stay there long enough to cripple the enemy logistics network. The Viet Minh had shown that they could support divisions in extended operations far from their bases, using porters and stockpiled rice. They had also demonstrated their willingness to accept heavy casualties. Giap had achieved his main objective in the Thai country. The French outpost line had been shattered, and the road to Laos was open. The garrisons at Lai Châu and Nha San were now isolated outposts, dependent entirely on air supply. The French High Command would have to decide whether to reinforce them, evacuate them, or use them as bait. The decision would shape the coming year. The French began to see the value of the fortified airhead as a way to force the Viet Minh to fight on ground of French choosing. Nha San had proven that the concept could work, but the conditions required for success were stringent. The camp had to be supplied by a secure airfield, the terrain had to favor the defender, and the garrison had to have overwhelming firepower. The Viet Minh had to be willing to attack. The combination was rare. Salan and his staff began to look at other locations where the concept could be applied. The key was to find a place that Giap would be forced to attack, either because it blocked a critical route or because its loss would be a political disaster. Salan's staff surveyed the region, identifying Dien Bien Phu as a possible blocking position on the road to Laos, but no firm decision was made that year. The selection of the site for a major camp would fall to his successor, General Navarre, in the autumn of 1953. The year ended with both sides maneuvering for position, each aware that the decisive battle was still to come. The French also took steps to strengthen their intelligence and guerrilla operations behind Viet Minh lines. Major Roger Trinquier was placed in command of the Mixed Native Commando Groups, or GCMA, which recruited tribal guerrillas to harass Viet Minh supply lines. These units were lightly equipped, supported by airdrops, and highly mobile. They could not stop the flow of Viet Minh supplies, but they could force Giap to divert troops to guard his rear areas. By the end of the year, thousands of guerrillas were operating in the Viet Bac. The Viet Minh responded by committing regular battalions to counter the guerrilla threat. The security of their supply lines was too important to leave to local forces. Giap had to balance the demands of his offensive operations with the need to protect his depots and routes. The French guerrilla campaign was a nuisance, but it did not stop the movement of supplies to the Thai country. The porter columns continued to move through the mountains, carrying rice and ammunition to the forward divisions. The year 1952 had been one of transition. The French had learned that they could not hold distant outposts without secure supply lines. The Viet Minh had learned that they could sustain extended operations despite French air superiority. Both sides had suffered heavy losses, but neither had achieved a decisive advantage. The war was entering its most critical phase, and the terrain of the fighting was shifting to the remote northwest. The French High Command faced a difficult choice. They could concentrate their forces in the delta and abandon the Tay country and Laos, or they could commit their scarce resources to holding the northwest. The decision was not purely military. Laos was a member of the French Union, and abandoning it would have serious political consequences. The French government was unwilling to give up territory, but it was also unwilling to provide the reinforcements needed to hold it. Salan was replaced in June of 1953 by Lieutenant General Henri Navarre. The new commander arrived with a plan to stabilize the situation and build a mobile force capable of winning the war by 1955. The Navarre plan assumed that the Viet Minh could be forced into a decisive battle under conditions favorable to the French. The plan did not anticipate that the Viet Minh would choose the time and place of that battle. The events of 1952 had set the stage for the confrontation at Dien Bien Phu. The French had demonstrated their ability to hold a fortified camp supplied by air. The Viet Minh had demonstrated their ability to move heavy artillery through the mountains. The two capabilities would meet in the valley of Dien Bien Phu in the spring of 1954. The logistical systems of both sides would be tested to their limits. For the moment, the war continued along its accustomed lines. Patrols, ambushes, and small-scale engagements marked the daily routine. The Viet Minh prepared their next move, stockpiling supplies and training their troops. The French reinforced their positions, hoping that the coming year would bring a chance to turn the tide. Neither side could know that the decisive moment was still more than a year away, and that it would come in a place few had ever heard of. The campaign in the Thai country had demonstrated the resilience of the Viet Minh logistical system. The porters had moved thousands of tons of supplies over distances of over 100 miles, often under French air attack. The system was primitive, but it was also highly adaptable. It did not depend on roads or bridges that could be bombed. It depended on tens of thousands of men and women walking through the jungle, carrying loads on their backs. As long as the Viet Minh could recruit porters, they could move supplies. The French had the advantages of motor transport, aircraft, and modern equipment. But those advantages came with a heavy logistical cost. Fuel, spare parts, and ammunition had to be moved in bulk. The supply lines were rigid and vulnerable. A single ambush could halt a convoy for days. The French logistical system was powerful, but it was also brittle. The Viet Minh system was weak, but it was flexible. In the end, flexibility would prove more important than power. Giap understood this. He had learned the lesson of 1951, when his divisions had outrun their supply lines and been forced to retreat. He had rebuilt his logistical system, stockpiled supplies at forward bases, and trained his staff to plan for extended operations. The Tay country campaign had been a test of the new system, and it had passed. The invasion of Laos, planned for the spring of 1953, would be the next step. The French also drew lessons from the Thai country campaign. The hedgehog concept had been validated at Nha San, but the limitations were clear. The successful defense of an airhead required absolute control of the air. The moment that control was challenged, the entire concept collapsed. The French assumed that the Viet Minh could not challenge their air superiority. That assumption would prove to be a fatal error. As 1952 drew to a close, the two sides paused to rest and regroup. The fighting would resume with the dry season, and both commanders were preparing for a decisive year. The French had lost the initiative in the Tay country, but they were planning new operations for the coming months. The Viet Minh had seized the strategic advantage, but they needed to consolidate their gains and build up their supply stocks for the next phase. The stockpiles at Nha San continued to grow. Ammunition, rations, fuel, and medical supplies were flown in daily. The garrison was comfortable, well-fed, and confident. The Viet Minh siege was ineffective, and the perimeter was secure. The French saw Nha San as a model for future operations. The Viet Minh saw it as a trap. Giap was content to let the French pour resources into a position that could be isolated and bypassed at will. The strategic debate within the French High Command continued. Some officers argued for a concentration of forces in the delta and an abandonment of peripheral positions. Others argued for an aggressive forward defense that would force the Viet Minh to fight for every mile of ground. The lack of clear direction from Paris made it difficult to choose a course. Navarre would have to make his own decisions when he arrived. The war had reached a stalemate. The French could hold the delta and a few fortified camps, but they could not defeat the Viet Minh in the field. The Viet Minh could operate freely in the northwest and infiltrate the delta, but they could not deliver a knockout blow. The conflict had become a war of attrition, measured in rice, ammunition, and porters. The side that could sustain its logistical effort the longest would eventually prevail. The French military and political situation was fragile. Public opinion in France was turning against the war, and the government was unstable. The United States was providing increasing amounts of aid, but that aid came with strings attached. There were those in Washington who believed that the French were not fighting hard enough to win. The relationship between the two allies was strained, and it would become more so as the war entered its final phase. The Viet Minh were not concerned with public opinion in France or the politics of the United States. They were fighting a people's war, and their strength came from the mobilization of the population. The porters who carried supplies to the front were not paid soldiers. They were farmers and laborers who believed in the cause. They worked for a few pounds of rice per day, and they did so under the constant threat of French air attack. The French still held the advantage in firepower and mobility. They had artillery, aircraft, and armored vehicles. The Viet Minh had porters, bicycles, and an endless willingness to endure hardship. The gap between the two systems was narrowing. Each month brought new shipments of Chinese weapons to the Viet Minh. Each month the French logisticians struggled to keep their overextended units supplied. As the monsoon season ended and the dry weather returned, both sides prepared for the campaign of 1953. Giap was planning his invasion of Laos, aiming to draw the French ever deeper into the empty lands. Navarre was planning his counterstroke, hoping to catch the Viet Minh in the open and destroy them. Neither commander knew that the decisive battle would be fought not on the roads of Laos or in the hills of the Thai country, but in a small valley called Dien Bien Phu. The winter of 1953 brought no rest for the French Union forces in Tonkin. Lieutenant General Salan sat in his headquarters in Hanoi studying the reports that crossed his desk day after day. The Viet Minh had not withdrawn into their base areas after the failed assaults on Nha San. Instead, General Giap was repositioning his divisions for a new kind of campaign, one that would test the limits of both armies in ways neither commander fully anticipated. The Central Highlands erupted on January 23 when two Viet Minh regiments struck the French outpost at An Khe. The 84th and 95th Independent Regiments moved with speed and precision, threatening to cut Route Coloniale 19 and isolate the towns of Kontum and Pleiku. Salan reacted quickly, ordering 3 parachute battalions to be airlifted from reserve positions in the delta directly into the battle zone. The C-47 transports lifted off from the dusty airstrips around Hanoi carrying paratroopers who had been training for just such emergencies. They dropped into the highlands under clear skies, forming defensive perimeters around the threatened positions within hours of the first alert. The Viet Minh regiments, surprised by the speed of the French response, broke contact and melted back into the jungle-covered hills. The French had won a tactical victory at An Khe, but the cost was hidden in the balance sheets of the logistical staff. Every parachute battalion flown into the Central Highlands meant fewer aircraft available for the regular resupply runs to the isolated garrisons scattered across northwestern Tonkin. The air transport fleet was showing signs of strain, and there were no reserve aircraft waiting for call-up. Major Trinquier had been running guerrilla operations behind Viet Minh lines since late 1951. His mixed native commando groups harassed supply columns and gathered intelligence on enemy movements, but they could not stop the steady buildup of Viet Minh forces in the areas facing Laos. The GCMA operations tied down perhaps 10 Viet Minh battalions, but the enemy simply recruited more porters and expanded their network of jungle trails. By February, Salan understood that GIAP was preparing something larger than a local offensive. The concentration of the 308th, 312th, and 316th Divisions in the region around Dien Bien Phu and along the Laotian border could mean only one thing. The invasion of Laos was coming, and the French would have to decide how much of that kingdom they could afford to defend. General Giap launched his invasion of Laos on April 9, 1953. 3 full divisions crossed the border in a coordinated advance that covered as much as 20 miles per day through the rugged mountain terrain. The 312th Division moved down the Nam O River Valley toward the royal capital of Luang Prabang, while the 316th Division drove southeast toward the plain of Jars and the approaches to Vientiane. The 308th Division remained in reserve at first, positioned to reinforce either flank as the situation developed. Behind these advancing divisions moved a human wave of 200,000 porters carrying rice bags, ammunition boxes, and mortar rounds on their backs and bicycles. The supply columns stretched for miles along the jungle trails, invisible from the air under the thick canopy. The French had known the invasion was coming, but the speed of the advance caught them off guard. Outposts that had been held for years fell in hours as the Viet Minh regiments bypassed strongpoints and surrounded isolated garrisons. The garrison commander at Xieng Koang received orders to evacuate on April 12 and begin a fighting withdrawal to the west. The road from Xieng Koang to the plain of Jars became a gauntlet of ambushes and harassing fire. The French columns moved in short bounds, fighting through roadblocks and bypassing destroyed bridges while the Viet Minh pressed from all sides. Aircraft flew constant cover overhead, but the jungle hid the enemy gunners who fired from the slopes above the road. Salan made a difficult decision. He would concentrate his available forces on 2 positions, Luang Prabang, the ancient royal capital, and the plain of Jars, which offered a flat open area suitable for an airland base. The scattered outposts in between would have to fend for themselves or fall back as best they could. The garrison of Sam Nua received the evacuation order on April 12. 2,400 men began a 110-mile retreat through country that was already swarming with enemy troops. Viet Minh blocking forces appeared at every crossroads and bridge, forcing the column to fight for every mile of its withdrawal. Only 180 men reached friendly lines. The rest were killed, captured, or simply vanished into the jungle. The loss of Sam Noah represented the destruction of the equivalent of 5 battalions, a heavy blow to the already stretched French order of battle. Further north, the garrison of Muang Kua faced an even grimmer fate. A single Laotian battalion commanded by a French captain was ordered to hold the position against the advancing 312th Division for 2 weeks to buy time for the withdrawal of other units. The captain deployed his men in defensive positions around the small outpost, knowing that relief was unlikely. The battalion held for 36 days against the full weight of a Viet Minh division. The defenders fought from foxholes and ruined buildings, calling in airstrikes on their own positions when the enemy broke through the perimeter. They held until the final assault overwhelmed them, with only 4 known survivors. The sacrifice of Muang Kua bought time for the defensive line forming on the plain of Jars. But the cost was staggering, and the moral effect on the Laotian troops who heard the news was impossible to measure. Each lost outpost narrowed the options available to the French command. On April 19th, the French established Jars Camp on the plain of Jars. The position was an open plateau 18 miles by 15 miles, surrounded by hills that offered the enemy excellent observation points. The garrison would have to be supplied entirely by air, with the nearest major airfield at Hanoi over 500 miles away to the northeast. The airlift began immediately. C-47 transports flew in troops, artillery pieces, ammunition, and rations in a continuous stream that taxed the capacity of every available aircraft in Indochina. The priority given to JAR's camp meant that other garrisons, including the 10,000 men still holding Nasan, had to accept reduced supply levels. Major General Cogni, commanding in Tonkin, watched the diversion of air transport with growing alarm. He had argued against the establishment of distant hedgehog positions that would consume resources needed for the defense of the delta. But the political necessity of defending Laos overruled the tactical logic of concentration, and the aircraft kept flying west. The Viet Minh did not give the French time to complete their defenses. On the night of April 26, two divisions launched a coordinated assault on JAR's camp. The attack was hasty, lacking the careful preparation that characterized most Viet Minh operations, but it was pressed with great determination. The French artillery crews worked their guns through the night, firing star shells to illuminate the advancing enemy infantry. The defenders held their sectors, repelling wave after wave of attackers with small arms, machine guns, and mortar fire. By dawn, the Viet Minh had withdrawn, leaving hundreds of dead on the slopes around the perimeter. The victory at JAR's camp validated the hedgehog concept once again. A fortified base supplied by air could hold out against conventional assault if the garrison was strong enough and the ammunition held out. But the cost of maintaining such a position was enormous, and the enemy had shown that he could simply bypass the position and continue his advance elsewhere. The Viet Minh attack on JAR's camp had failed to overrun the position, but the diversion of French air transport to support the camp had exposed a critical weakness in the French logistical system. The transports could not be everywhere at once, and every commitment to a distant outpost meant a corresponding reduction in support for every other position. The 308th Division, which had been held in reserve, now moved south toward Luang Prabang. The royal capital was defended by 3 French battalions and several Laotian units, but the garrison was outnumbered and the enemy approach could not be stopped. The French command prepared to defend the city street by street if necessary. The weather began to turn against the Viet Minh as the monsoon approached. The rains would make the jungle trails impassable for the porter columns that supplied the advancing divisions. General Giap understood that he had perhaps 2 weeks before the logistical window closed. The Viet Minh made one final attempt to take Luang Prabang, but the attack was poorly coordinated and the defenders held. On May 7th, Giap issued the order to withdraw the main body of his forces back to their base areas in Tonkin. The invasion of Laos was over for the season. The 308th Division did not return to the Viet Bac. Giap left it in position in northern Laos, where it could rest, refit, and prepare for future operations. Supply caches were established along the invasion routes, stocked with rice and ammunition cached in caves and under jungle cover for future use. The French had held Luang Prabang and JAR's camp, but the strategic victory belonged to Giap. He had demonstrated that his divisions could operate at a distance of over 200 miles from their bases for more than a month. The porter columns had kept them supplied, despite French air interdiction, moving at night under strict camouflage discipline. Lieutenant General Salan assessed the results of the campaign and found them deeply troubling. The French had committed their reserves to defend Laos, but they had not defeated the enemy in a decisive battle. The Viet Minh had simply withdrawn, leaving behind a network of caches that would support future offensives. The air transport fleet had been pushed to its limits and beyond. The C-47s had flown continuous sorties for weeks, and the maintenance crews struggled to keep the aging aircraft in serviceable condition. The reserves of parachutes and airdrop equipment were running low, and there was no prospect of significant reinforcement from France. The campaign had revealed the fundamental weakness of the French position. They could defend any single point by concentrating air transport, but they could not defend every point simultaneously. Each new commitment opened a vulnerability elsewhere, and the enemy had the initiative to choose where to strike next. Major Trincier's guerrilla forces continued to operate behind Viet Minh lines, gathering intelligence and harassing supply columns, but the GCMA could not stop the flow of porters, and the Viet Minh had shown that they could deploy as many as 10 battalions to protect their lines of communication without slowing their offensive operations. The monsoon season ended the campaign in May of 1953. The rains washed out roads and trails, grounding aircraft and halting large-scale operations until the autumn. Both sides used the respite to rebuild their strength and plan for the next round of fighting, knowing that the war was entering a new and more dangerous phase. The new French commander arrived in June of 1953 with a plan that would decide the war. Lieutenant General Henri Navarre had studied the maps and reports during his long flight from Paris. The situation he inherited was grim. Enemy divisions roamed freely across the northern highlands. French reserves were scattered across a dozen isolated outposts. Something had to change. Unveiled on June 16th, the Navarre plan was already in motion before the new commander officially took charge. It called for a defensive posture in the north through the coming campaign season. French forces would avoid major battles while rebuilding their mobile reserves. Meanwhile, offensive operations would clear the guerrilla zones in the south and center of the country. The final decisive campaign would wait until 1955. That was the theory. The plan rested on a single critical assumption. The Viet Minh could not sustain prolonged operations far from their bases. Their porters would exhaust themselves. Their supply lines would snap under pressure. Navarre believed that if the French could force a set-piece battle deep in the highlands, the enemy logistical system would collapse. He was wrong. The handover of command took place at the end of June. Lieutenant General Salan departed after overseeing the brutal campaigns of the previous year. He left behind a force that had held its ground but was stretched to the breaking point. The air transport fleet was worn down. The depots were low on reserve parachutes and drop containers. Navarre inherited a machine running on momentum, not strength. Colonel Jean-Louis Nicot commanded the air transport arm. He studied the supply requirements for any future operation in the highlands and saw an impossible equation. The C-47 fleet could not simultaneously support isolated garrisons and a major new base. When briefed on early plans for a fortified camp in the northwest, Nicot stated flatly that he could not guarantee the required flow of supplies. His warning was noted and then set aside. In mid-July, the French launched a raid that showed what their airborne forces could achieve. Operation Hirondelle targeted the Viet Minh supply caves at Qui Lua near Lang Son. 3 parachute battalions dropped into the valley at dawn. The defenders were caught completely by surprise. The paratroopers worked through the day and into the night. They destroyed some 5,000 tons of enemy equipment and supplies inside the limestone caverns. Chinese-made rifles, Russian ammunition crates, and stacks of uniforms went up in flames. The raiders then withdrew overland to the coast, where naval vessels waited to take them back to Haiphong. It was a textbook operation, but the success at Lang Son carried a hidden danger. It reinforced the belief that airborne raids and air-supplied bases could dominate the highlands. The Viet Minh had lost a month of supplies, not the means to wage war. Their logistical system was too dispersed to be broken by a single blow. The French command did not fully grasp this truth. In August, the garrison at Nha San was evacuated. The fortified camp had held out against determined Viet Minh assaults the previous winter. Its 12,000 defenders had been supplied entirely by air for months, but the camp had outlived its purpose. The enemy had simply bypassed it and pushed into Laos. The evacuation was executed with precision. Over 6 days, the garrison was reduced from 12,000 men to 5,000. Then the remaining troops were airlifted out under cover of night. The last aircraft lifted off on August 13th. General Giap, for reasons that remain unclear, did not attack the evacuation. His radio intercepts had apparently misled him into thinking the French were reinforcing the position, not abandoning it. The successful evacuation of Nha San reinforced a dangerous overconfidence. French commanders concluded that a fortified camp supplied by air could be held indefinitely, then abandoned at will if the situation turned sour. They overlooked the vital factor that Nha San had never been seriously threatened by enemy artillery. The next camp would not be so fortunate. Tons of supplies were destroyed or left behind during the evacuation of Nha San. Precious pierced steel planking was abandoned. Ammunition dumps were blown up. The Viet Minh gathered whatever remained and added it to their growing stockpiles. The French had lost the position, but they believed they had learned a valuable lesson about the flexibility of air supply. In truth, they had learned the wrong lesson. Through the late summer and early fall, the French conducted a series of operations to disrupt Viet Minh infiltration of the Red River Delta. Operation Muette was launched in mid-October. 6 mobile groups supported by tanks and amphibious vehicles encircled the enemy's 320th Division south of the Delta. The fighting was fierce. French forces mauled the 320th Division badly. The 48th and 64th Viet Minh regiments fought stubborn delaying actions while their supply base at Phu No Quan was evacuated. When the operation ended in early November, the French had inflicted heavy casualties but failed to destroy the enemy division. The Viet Minh had saved most of their supplies and withdrew to fight another day. The pattern was becoming clear. The Viet Minh would trade space for time whenever the French committed overwhelming force. Their logistical system could absorb the loss of forward depots because the real stocks lay deeper in the rear, hidden in caves and dispersed caches. The French were winning battles but losing the war of attrition. Colonel Louis Bataille, Navarre's chief planner, worked through the fall on a bolder concept. He proposed establishing a fortified camp at Dien Bien Phu, a small valley in the far northwest near the Laotian border. The position would block the enemy's invasion route into Laos. It would also serve as a base for guerrilla operations against Viet Minh supply lines. The plan had a certain tactical elegance, but Bertel's planning was built on flawed assumptions. He calculated that the Viet Minh could not bring heavy artillery into the surrounding hills. The terrain was too rugged, the roads too poor. He also assumed the enemy could not supply more than 2 divisions for more than a few weeks. Both assumptions were wrong, and the consequences would be catastrophic. On November 20th, Operation Castor began. 2,200 paratroopers of the airborne group commanded by Brigadier General Jean Gilles dropped into the Dien Bien Phu Valley. The small enemy garrison of the 148th Independent Regiment was quickly overwhelmed. The valley was secured within hours. The paratroopers who landed that morning found the valley floor covered with tall grass. The surrounding hills rose steep and green. The only structure of note was a small airstrip built years earlier by the Japanese. It was now cracked and overgrown. Engineers began repairing it immediately. The Viet Minh did not contest the landing. The French were able to bring in bulldozers, rollers, and thousands of sheets of pierced steel planking. By November 25th, the airstrip was operational. C-47 transports began landing with reinforcements, artillery pieces, and ammunition. The build-up was underway. The valley was 6 miles long and 3 miles wide. It was surrounded by forested hills that rose to dominate the floor below. French commanders noted the vulnerability, but believed their artillery and air power could dominate the heights. They did not yet understand that the Viet Minh were already moving heavy guns into those same hills, using thousands of porters and dozens of captured trucks. By early December, the Northwest Operational Group was established to command the forces at Dien Bien Phu. The garrison had grown to 9,600 men. Mobile groups, artillery batteries, and tank platoons were flown in. The camp was taking shape as a fortified hedgehog intended to block the road to Laos. But the evacuation of the French position at Lai Chau on December 10th cast a dark shadow over the build-up. The garrison of 2,000 men attempted to withdraw overland to Dien Bien Phu through enemy-held territory. Thai irregulars accompanied by French advisors moved through the jungle in small columns. The Viet Minh 316th Division hunted them down. Only about 100 men reached the safety of Dien Bien Phu. The rest were killed or captured in the dense jungle. The survivors arrived exhausted, their uniforms torn, their weapons gone. They brought with them reports of enemy divisions massing in the hills. The French perimeter at Dien Bien Phu was no longer a blocking position. It was becoming a trap. While the build-up at Dien Bien Phu continued, Lieutenant General Navarre authorized a major offensive in central Vietnam. Operation Atlante was launched on January 20th against the Viet Minh bases around Tu Hoa. The operation consumed 33 French battalions and significant air transport resources. Major General Cogny, commanding in Tonkin, protested the diversion of forces from the critical northern theatre. His objections were overruled. The timing could not have been worse. At Dien Bien Phu, the garrison had reached 13,200 men by January 25th. Stockpiles stood at 9 days of rations and 8 days of fuel. Ammunition for the 105mm howitzers was sufficient for perhaps 600 rounds per gun in sustained combat. The planners had aimed for a 2-day reserve against a 5-day battle. They would need more than 50 days of fighting. The problem of supply was becoming acute. The average daily requirement for the garrison was calculated at 102 tons. But the planned airlift capacity based on the limited flying hours each morning due to fog was only 73 tons per day. Even under ideal conditions, the camp would consume more than the transports could deliver. The deficit would have to be made up from stockpiles that did not exist. Colonel Nickott studied the figures with mounting concern. His C-47 fleet was already stretched to support the Laotian garrisons. Maintenance problems kept a quarter of his aircraft grounded at any time. The aerial resupply companies were working around the clock to pack parachutes and rig cargo loads. Every ton delivered to Dien Bien Phu meant a ton not delivered somewhere else. On January 27th, General Giap launched a diversion that deepened the French supply crisis. The Viet Minh 308th Division moved south from its positions near Dien Bien Phu toward Luang Prabang. The royal capital of Laos was threatened by 4 enemy columns advancing through the mountain passes. Navarre had no choice but to respond. The French airlift shifted priority to Laos. C-47s that had been flying into Dien Bien Phu were redirected to Muang Sai, Luang Prabang, and the plain of Jars. Between January 26th and February 24th, deliveries to Dien Bien Phu dropped to an average of only 64 tons per day. The garrison was consuming its stockpiles faster than they could be replenished. On February 13th, reinforcements were airlifted into Luang Prabang. 4 infantry battalions were flown in to bolster the defenses. The operation consumed every available transport aircraft. At Dien Bien Phu, the men watched the skies grow quiet. The steady drone of approaching C-47s became less frequent. The depots began to empty. The 308th Division did not launch a major assault on Luang Prabang. It maneuvered, probed, and kept the French off balance. The strategic effect was achieved not through combat, but through logistics. By threatening Laos, Giap forced the French to divert the airlift that was the lifeline of Dien Bien Phu. The trap was being set. On February 24th, Navarre ordered first priority on air transport shifted back to Dien Bien Phu. The diversion to Laos was over. But 17 days of reduced deliveries had consumed the margin of safety the garrison had built up. The stockpiles were dangerously low. Every aircraft that could fly was pressed into service. Between February 24th and March 13th, the French delivered 1,752 tons of supplies to Dien Bien Phu. The average daily delivery rose to 103 tons. Ammunition stockpiles were partially rebuilt. Rations and fuel were brought up to minimum levels. But the effort consumed the last reserves of the air transport fleet. On the night of March 3rd, Viet Minh commandos attacked Gia Lam airfield outside Hanoi. They cut through the perimeter wire and moved through the darkness toward the parked transport planes. Explosions ripped through the maintenance hangars. 10 C-47s were damaged before the defenders drove the attackers off. 3 nights later, another raid struck Cat Bai airfield near Haiphong. 60 commandos crept through the base sewers to emerge inside the perimeter. They carried satchel charges and automatic weapons. A light bomber and 6 observation aircraft were destroyed. 3 more bombers were damaged. The attacks were a direct strike on the logistical system supporting Dien Bien Phu. The raids were a warning that the Viet Minh could reach the French rear areas. They had infiltrated agents and sabotage teams through the porous defenses of the Red River Delta. The airfields that fed Dien Bien Phu were no longer secure. Every damaged transport meant fewer sorties, fewer tons delivered, fewer shells for the gunners in the valley. By early March, the Viet Minh had massed more than 40,000 troops around Dien Bien Phu. The ring was tightening. The 308th Division had returned from its diversion into Laos. The 312th Division was in place to the north. The 316th Division held the eastern hills. The 304th Division was moving up from the south. The artillery had arrived as well. 24 105mm howitzers, 12 75mm pack howitzers, and dozens of 81mm mortars and 37mm anti-aircraft guns were in position. They had been manhandled up the mountain slopes by porters working through the night. The French commanders on the ground did not know how many guns the enemy had. They would learn soon enough. The men inside the camp waited. They dug trenches, laid minefields, and stacked sandbags. The airstrip remained open, but enemy artillery was already registering targets. The pilots flew their final approach through a corridor of potential fire. The gunners at the French artillery batteries checked their firing data and waited for the order to shoot. The campaign had been long and exhausting. The French had moved men and supplies across the mountains by air for months. The air crews were exhausted. The ground crews worked through the night to keep the planes flying. The supply officers juggled priorities across a dozen threatened outposts, and now the decisive battle was about to begin. The Viet Minh had achieved something remarkable. They had sustained the logistics of an entire field army across 200 miles of mountain trails, far from their own bases. The French had complete command of the air. They had bombers and fighters and napalm and reconnaissance aircraft. They had transport planes that could reach any point in the theater within hours. But they could not stop the flow of supplies to the hills around Dien Bien Phu. The trap was complete. The French had established a fortified camp deep in enemy territory, supplied by a single strand of air transport. The Viet Minh had gathered their divisions around it, cut its land access, and now prepared to cut its air link. The battle that would decide the war was about to begin. Inside the camp, Colonel Christian de la Croix de Castries commanded the garrison. He had arrived in January to take charge of the Northwest Operational Group. The defenses were organized into a series of strongpoints named for women and linked by trenches and barbed wire. The artillery batteries were dug in. The 10M24 Chaffee tanks were dispersed to support the infantry. The supply situation on March 12 was marginal. Ration stock stood at 9 days. Fuel was down to 8 days at current consumption rates. Artillery ammunition varied by caliber and position. Some batteries had 1,200 rounds per gun, others had only 700. There was no margin for error, no reserve to absorb a sustained siege. The French air transport fleet had delivered 30,000 tons of supplies across Indochina in the preceding 3 months. 11,000 tons had gone to Dien Bien Phu. The rest had been scattered to Laos, the Central Highlands, and the Delta garrisons. The system was running at its absolute limit. There was nothing left in reserve. Colonel Nicot had done everything possible. He had pushed his crews to fly double the normal sortie rate. He had cannibalized maintenance parts from grounded aircraft to keep others flying. He had begged for additional C-119s from American stocks. But no amount of effort could overcome the fundamental mathematics of the situation. The demand exceeded the supply. The civilian pilots of the Civil Air Transport Corporation flew their missions without complaint. They earned $2,000 a month and faced the same anti-aircraft fire as the French military crews. Their C-119 flying boxcars could deliver 6 tons in a single pass, a capability that was proving vital. But they could not solve the underlying problem. The garrison needed more than the air fleet could deliver. The Viet Minh knew this. Their intelligence was excellent. They had agents in Hanoi and spies at the airfields. They monitored the frequency of flights and estimated the tonnage delivered. They knew the stockpiles were insufficient for a long siege. They planned to make the siege last as long as it took. The battle was scheduled to begin on March 13th. The Viet Minh artillery would open fire at dusk. The first assault would fall on the northern strongpoints known as Beatrice and Gabrielle. If those positions fell, the entire northern perimeter would be compromised. On the morning of March 13th, the sky over Dien Bien Phu was clear. The last supply flights came in before noon, landing on the pierced steel runway. The crews offloaded their cargo quickly and took off again. The sound of their engines faded to the east. Inside the camp, the men checked their weapons and waited. In Hanoi, Lieutenant General Navarre reviewed the situation reports. He had committed his strategic reserve to the defense of Dien Bien Phu. He had no fresh battalions to send, no additional aircraft to spare. The outcome of the battle would rest on the men in the valley and the fragile chain of aircraft that connected them to their base. He had done everything he could. It was not enough. The Navarre plan had been built on the assumption that the Viet Minh could not sustain a prolonged siege far from their bases. That assumption was about to be tested in the most brutal way possible. The enemy had not only sustained their forces, they had brought heavy artillery, anti-aircraft guns, and tens of thousands of infantry to the battlefield. They had built roads, established ammunition depots, and organized a supply system that moved forward with relentless efficiency. The French air transport crews would do their duty. They would fly into the valley under fire, drop their loads from higher and higher altitudes as the anti-aircraft fire intensified, and return with damaged aircraft and wounded crewmen. They would maintain the flow of supplies as long as the camp held out, but the mathematics of aerial supply would not change. The garrison needed more than the aircraft could deliver. The men at Dien Bien Phu did not know the details of the supply calculation. They knew only that the airstrip was still open. that the C-47s were still landing, that the ammunition was still coming. They did not yet understand that the battle was already lost in the planners' spreadsheets and the tonnage figures. The trap had been set, and the jaws were about to close. The Viet Minh artillery crews were ready. They had trained for months on the slopes of the surrounding hills. Their guns were concealed in caves and under camouflage netting. The ammunition was stacked within arm's reach. When the order came, they would open fire with a concentration that the French had believed impossible. The French artillery officers had studied the terrain and concluded that the enemy could not bring heavy guns into the hills. The gradient was too steep, the trails too narrow. They had not accounted for the thousands of porters who could dismantle a howitzer, carry it up the slope piece by piece, and reassemble it under cover of darkness. They had not understood that the Viet Minh logistical system was built not on roads and trucks, but on human muscle and determination. General Giap had achieved the strategic surprise he needed. The French believed they were establishing a blocking position that would force the Viet Minh to attack under unfavorable conditions. In reality, they had placed their garrison in a valley completely dominated by the surrounding terrain, at the end of an air supply line that could not sustain them, and invited the enemy to besiege them at a time and place of their choosing. The days leading up to the battle were quiet. Patrols went out from the perimeter and returned with reports of enemy activity in the hills. The sound of digging and hammering echoed from the slopes at night. The defenders knew the enemy was preparing. They did not know the full extent of what was coming. On March 12th, a Viet Minh deserter came into the French lines. He told interrogators that the attack would begin the following evening. The artillery bombardment would open the assault, followed by infantry waves against the northern strongpoints. The information was relayed to headquarters, but there was little the French could do to prepare. They were already as ready as they would ever be. The prologue became reality as the opening salvo of March 13th crushed the airstrip and sealed the fate of the garrison. The siege of Dien Bien Phu had begun. The garrison fought for 56 more days, but the outcome was sealed in those first hours. In Hanoi, the news of the bombardment arrived by radio within minutes. The headquarters staff understood the implications immediately. The airstrip was gone. The daily supply requirement of over 100 tons could not be met by parachute drop alone. Colonel Nicker had warned them. The air transport fleet was already exhausted, with a quarter of the C-47s grounded for maintenance. The Viet Minh commandos had damaged 10 transports at Gia Lam and more at Cat Bai. Now the garrison at Dien Bien Phu would have to survive on what could be pushed out of cargo doors at altitude. Colonel Castries reported the loss to Hanoi in terse radio messages. The garrison was still intact, but the pattern was clear. The Viet Minh had the initiative. They chose the time and the place of each assault. The French could only react, shifting their dwindling reserves from one threatened sector to another. The men in the trenches could see the enemy positions on the hilltops. They could see the flash of artillery pieces being fired from caves and emplacements. They knew that every day the siege continued. The supply situation grew more desperate. The airdrops began in earnest on March 15th. The C-47s took off from Gia Lam and Cat Bai, carrying loads of ammunition, rations, and medical supplies. They flew 200 miles over mountainous terrain, navigating by dead reckoning and radio beacons that the Viet Minh often jammed. The approach to Dien Bien Phu required the pilots to descend into a valley surrounded by hills that bristled with automatic weapons and anti-aircraft guns. The Viet Minh gunners had been trained to track the sound of engines and to fire at the sound of the cargo doors opening. The first drops were inaccurate. The supplies drifted off course in the mountain winds and landed in no man's land or behind Viet Minh lines. The garrison soldiers watched as pallets of ammunition and bags of rice came down among the enemy positions. The Viet Minh gathered what they could and added it to their own stockpiles. The French troops learned to rush to the drop zones the moment they heard the aircraft, hoping to secure the falling cargo before the enemy could claim it. It was a race fought under mortar fire, and the French were losing. The C-119 packets arrived with their larger cargo capacity and their rear clamshell doors. They could drop a full load in a single pass, reducing the time they spent over the valley. The American civilian pilots from the Civil Air Transport Corporation flew these missions. They were paid well, but no contract required them to fly into a combat zone. They did it anyway, day after day, dropping their loads at low altitude under heavy fire. The men on the ground called them the saviors of the garrison. Without the C-119s, the daily tonnage delivered would have collapsed entirely. By the third week of March, the Viet Minh had tightened the noose. Their trenches crept forward each night, digging closer to the French positions. The 312th Division had captured the strongpoint of Gabriel after a brutal two-day battle. The 308th Division had overrun Anne-Marie, which was defended by Thai irregulars who broke and ran under the weight of the assault. The perimeter was shrinking. The airstrip was now within range of small arms fire. The engineers who tried to repair it were shot dead on the runway. The Viet Minh artillery grew more accurate with each passing day. They had observation posts on the hills that overlooked the entire valley. Every French position was visible to them. Every movement of troops or supplies could be seen and reported. The French tried to counter with their remaining 105mm howitzers and the 155mm battery, but the ammunition was running low. Each gun was allocated a strict number of rounds per day. The gunners had to choose their targets with care, conserving shells for the next assault they knew was coming. The monsoon rains began in late March. The trenches became canals of mud. The wounded who could not be evacuated lay in the field hospitals, their wounds turning septic in the damp. The supply drops became even more erratic. The low cloud cover forced the transport pilots to fly even lower to find the drop zone, putting them within range of the Viet Minh machine guns. Several C-47s were hit and went down in flames, their cargoes scattering across the mountainsides. The crews who survived the crash were never seen again. The morale of the garrison began to fray. The men were exhausted from weeks of constant alert. They slept in their foxholes in the mud, under the endless drizzle. The food was adequate but monotonous. The cigarettes ran out. The mail stopped arriving. The only connection to the outside world was the radio, and the news from Hanoi was not encouraging. The Viet Minh were infiltrating the delta. The reserves that Navarre had hoped to send north were tied down by the diversionary operations that Giap had orchestrated across the theater. On March 30th, the Viet Minh launched their first general assault. The attack fell on the eastern strongpoints of Dominique and Elaine, which guarded the approaches to the central camp. The 312th and 316th Divisions attacked in concert, their infantry advancing under a creeping barrage of mortar and artillery fire. The French defenders opened fire with every weapon they had. The machine guns cut down the first wave. The second wave came over the bodies of the first. The fighting was close and brutal, with bayonets and grenades used in the trenches. The Viet Minh had learned from their earlier battles. They did not attack in dense human waves that invited massacre by artillery and air power. They attacked in small groups, using the folds of the terrain and the darkness to infiltrate between the French strongpoints. Once inside the perimeter, they engaged the defenders from the flanks and rear. The French units became isolated, each position fighting its own battle without knowledge of what was happening on either side. The coordination that the French had relied upon began to break down. The strongpoint of Dominique changed hands 3 times during that first night of the general assault. The French Foreign Legion paratroopers counter-attacked with bayonets and threw the Viet Minh back from the crest of the hill. But the second wave hit them before they could dig in. The Viet Minh artillery shifted its fire onto the reverse slope, catching the French reserves as they moved forward. By dawn, the Viet Minh held the eastern half of Dominique. The French held the western half. Between them lay a no-man's land of shell craters and bodies. The battle for Elaine was equally savage. The strongpoint was defended by the 5th Vietnamese Parachute Battalion, which had been dropped into the camp in early March. They fought with a desperation that surprised their Viet Minh opponents, but the enemy had the advantage of numbers and artillery. The Vietnamese paras held their ground through the night, but by morning they had lost half their strength. The survivors were pulled back to a smaller perimeter. Elaine was now too close to the enemy lines to be safely resupplied by parachute. The general assault of March 30th cost the Viet Minh heavy casualties. The French estimated over 1,000 enemy dead in the fighting for Dominique and Elaine alone, but the Viet Minh could absorb those losses. They had reserves. The French did not. Every man killed or wounded in the garrison was a permanent reduction in combat power. The medical teams worked around the clock, but the supply of plasma and antibiotics was running low. The wounded who could not be evacuated faced a slow and painful death in the overcrowded aid stations. The rains continued through the first week of April. The transport aircraft flew whenever the weather allowed, but the sortie rate was falling. The C-47s were wearing out. Engines failed. Landing gear collapsed. The maintenance crews in Hanoi worked double shifts, but they could not keep the fleet at full strength. The number of daily missions dropped from 50 to 30, then to 20. The tonnage delivered to Dien Bien Phu fell from 130 tons per day at the peak to barely 70 tons per day by mid-April. The parachute shortage became critical. Each cargo drop required a large parachute and a container. These were not reusable. Once the chute landed, it was often torn, or it landed in enemy territory, or it was destroyed by fire. The American supply of parachutes was generous, but even the United States could not keep pace with the rate of consumption. The French riggers at Gia Lam worked around the clock, packing chutes and loading containers. The physical strain on the personnel was enormous. The quality of the packing began to suffer. Parachutes failed to open, and valuable cargo crashed into the mud of the drop zone. The weather in mid-April turned against the defenders. The low clouds and heavy rain reduced visibility to near zero for days at a time. The transport pilots could not find the valley. They circled in the mist, burning fuel, hoping for a break in the clouds that did not come. Some aircraft returned to Hanoi with their cargo still on board. Others attempted to drop by instrument, releasing their loads over the estimated position of the camp. The supplies fell into the jungle, into the river, into Viet Minh trenches. The garrison watched their food and ammunition dissolve into the fog. The Viet Minh anti-aircraft fire grew more intense with each passing week. They had brought forward additional 37mm guns and heavy machine guns. The transport aircraft could no longer fly at low altitude over the valley. The C-47s were forced to drop from 5,000 feet, then from 7,000 feet, then from 9,000 feet. At those altitudes, the wind carried the parachutes far from the intended drop zone. Supplies landed in the Viet Minh rear areas with increasing frequency. The garrison estimated that by late April, as much as a third of the cargo dropped was lost to the enemy. The Viet Minh now had the advantage in artillery ammunition. The French guns were rationed to 10 rounds per day per piece. The Viet Minh guns fired hundreds of rounds each day. They had stockpiled massive amounts of ammunition in the hills, brought forward by porters and trucks over the same trails that the French had believed impassable. The 105mm howitzers that had been supplied by China maintained a steady fire throughout each day and night. The French positions were subjected to a constant bombardment that wore down the men and the fortifications. The garrison tried to maintain a defensive routine. The men slept in shifts. The trenches were repaired each night after the daylight bombardment. The wounded were consolidated into the central aid stations, where the surgical teams worked by lamplight under the constant threat of artillery fire. The morale of the troops was surprisingly resilient. The French Foreign Legion paratroopers, the North African tirailleurs, the Vietnamese paras, the artillerymen, they all understood that they were holding the line for a larger strategy. But the larger strategy was failing, and they knew it. The radio traffic between Castres and Cogni in Hanoi became more frequent. Castres reported the supply shortages, the casualty rates, the contraction of the perimeter. Cogni promised reinforcements, but both men knew that no significant force could break through the Viet Minh encirclement. The relief operation, Condor, had stalled in northern Laos. The terrain was too difficult. The Viet Minh blocking forces were too strong. The days of a column of infantry marching to the relief of an isolated garrison were over. Dien Bien Phu would have to fight on alone. On April 15th, the supply deliveries reached their peak for the siege, about 130 tons in a single day. The weather cleared briefly, and the C-1119s flew mission after mission, dropping their loads over the central camp. The garrison recovered most of the supplies, and for a single day, the stockpiles increased, but the effort was unsustainable. The transport fleet was flying at maximum capacity, and the losses were mounting. 3 C-47s were shot down that day. Another crashed on landing back at Gia Lam. The crews were exhausted. The aircraft were wearing out. The Viet Minh understood that they could not stop the airlift entirely, but they could make it increasingly costly. Their anti-aircraft gunners had learned to track the approach patterns of the transport aircraft. They knew that the C-47s and C-119s had to fly through the same valleys to reach Dien Bien Phu. They positioned their guns to cover those approach corridors. The transport crews flew into a gauntlet of fire every time they approached the valley. The Viet Minh did not have to shoot down every aircraft. They only had to make the drops so dangerous that the pilots would prefer to turn back. On April 24th, the American civilian C-119 crews were pulled from the Dien Bien Phu runs. The diplomatic reasons were never fully explained, but the timing could not have been worse. The C-119s were the backbone of the heavy lift capability. Without them, the daily tonnage delivered fell by nearly half. The remaining French military C-47s could not make up the difference. The garrison felt the impact immediately. The supply deliveries dropped below 50 tons per day. The stockpiles of ammunition and rations began their final decline. The French military crews continued to fly, but they were stretched to the breaking point. Many pilots were logging over 150 flying hours per month, more than 3 times the normal peacetime rate. The maintenance crews could barely keep the C-47s airworthy. Engines were changed in the open, under makeshift tarps, in the rain. The spare parts that arrived from the United States were often the wrong type. The air transport system was running on momentum and sheer willpower, and it was approaching collapse. The garrison at Dien Bien Phu was now down to less than a week of rations. The artillery ammunition was severely depleted. Some batteries had fewer than 50 rounds remaining. The Viet Minh shelling did not let up. Their guns fired day and night, methodically hammering the remaining French positions. The strongpoints that had been named for women were now reduced to piles of rubble and craters. The men who held them were living in holes in the ground, their supplies running out, their hopes fading with each passing day. The Viet Minh did not launch a major assault during the last week of April. They did not need to. Their siege was working. The French garrison was being starved into submission. The perimeter was shrinking. The drop zones were now within range of small arms fire from the captured strongpoints. The transport aircraft had to drop their loads from even higher altitudes, and the accuracy fell to less than 50%. The men on the ground watched as a third of the supplies fell to the enemy, and another third landed in the river or the swamp. The medical situation was catastrophic. The wounded filled every available shelter. The surgical teams had run out of anesthesia. Amputations were performed with whatever was available. The dead were buried in shallow graves that were often reopened by the next shelling. The living envied the dead. The morale of the garrison was sustained only by the hope that a peace settlement might be reached at the Geneva Conference, which had opened at the end of April. The men in the trenches listened to the radio broadcast from France, hoping for news that the war would end before they were all killed or captured. General Giap prepared his final assault. The Viet Minh had learned the cost of frontal attacks during the battles of March and April. They had taken heavy losses, but they had also gained experience. The infantry had learned to coordinate with the artillery. The anti-aircraft gunners had learned to track the transport planes. The morale of the Viet Minh soldiers was high. They could see that the French positions were crumbling. The perimeter was shrinking. The supply drops were becoming less frequent. Victory was within their grasp, and they were determined to seize it. The 1st of May arrived with a clear sky. The transport aircraft tried to fly, but the Viet Minh anti-aircraft fire was so intense that several sorties were aborted. The garrison received less than 30 tons of supplies that day. The men knew that the end was near. The final assault began that evening. The Viet Minh 308th Division attacked the western strongpoints. The 312th Division struck from the east. The 316th Division hit the southern perimeter. The attacks were coordinated and sustained. The French positions were overwhelmed one by one. The fighting on May 1st and 2nd was the most intense of the entire siege. The Viet Minh artillery fired continuously, saturating the remaining French positions with high explosive. The infantry advanced behind the barrage, using flamethrowers and explosive charges to clear the bunkers. The French defenders fought with the desperation of men who knew they would not be rescued. They counterattacked with bayonets and grenades, throwing back the first waves. But the Viet Minh had reserves, and the French did not. Each counterattack cost men that could not be replaced. The strongpoints fell one by one. The western positions were overrun by the 308th Division after a savage night battle. The eastern strongpoints, already reduced to rubble, were captured by the 312th Division. The central camp was now exposed to direct fire from 3 sides. The Viet Minh artillery registered the command bunker and the aid stations. Shells rained down on the headquarters area. Colonel Castries and his staff remained in their bunker, coordinating the defense by radio as the perimeter collapsed around them. By May 5th, the French garrison held only a small area around the central camp. The drop zones had been captured by the Viet Minh. The transport aircraft could no longer deliver supplies to the garrison. The sorties were cancelled. The men in the camp knew that they were now entirely on their own. The radio traffic between Castries and Cogni in Hanoi took on a tone of finality. No rescue was coming. No reinforcements would arrive. The garrison would fight until it could fight no more, and then it would surrender. The Viet Minh did not rush the final attack. They took their time, bringing forward artillery and mortars to pound the remaining positions. The French soldiers could see the enemy infantry massing in the hills, preparing for the final assault. They knew that they could not hold out for much longer. The ammunition was nearly gone. The food was exhausted. The wounded were dying in the aid stations. The garrison had fought for 56 days. They had held the line as long as humanly possible. Now the line was gone. On the morning of May 7th, the Viet Minh launched their final assault. The 308th Division attacked from the west. The 312th Division attacked from the east. The 316th Division attacked from the south. The remnants of the French garrison fought with whatever they had left. The tanks of the armored squadron, their ammunition exhausted, were used as fixed fortifications. The crew members fired their personal weapons through the vision slits. The machine guns fired their last belts. The artillery fired their last rounds. The French soldiers fixed bayonets and waited for the enemy to come. The Viet Minh infantry swarmed over the remaining positions. The fighting was hand-to-hand, savage, and brief. The French defenders were overwhelmed by sheer numbers. The command bunker was surrounded. Colonel Castries radioed Hanoi for the last time. His message was brief. The garrison was overrun. He would surrender to prevent further loss of life. The radio went silent. The Viet Minh soldiers entered the bunker and found the French commander in his map room, surrounded by his staff. The Battle of Dien Bien Phu was over. The prisoners were gathered in the central camp. The Viet Minh were efficient in their treatment of the captured. The officers were separated from the enlisted men. The wounded were given what medical care was available. The dead were buried in mass graves. The Viet Minh had won a victory that changed the course of the war. They had defeated a modern army equipped with artillery, tanks, and aircraft. They had done it with porters, bicycles, and sheer determination. The lesson was clear. Logistics, not technology, had decided the outcome. The news of the fall of Dien Bien Phu reached Hanoi in the early afternoon of May 7th. The French headquarters went into shock. The scale of the defeat was unprecedented. The entire garrison of over 15,000 men had been lost. The political impact was immediate. The French government, already weakened by years of war, had no stomach for continuing the conflict. The negotiations at the Geneva Conference, which had been dragging on for weeks, now took on a new urgency. The French were ready to end the war. The Viet Minh had achieved their goal. They had forced a decisive battle and won. The French were now willing to negotiate a settlement that recognized the independence of Vietnam, at least in the north. The Viet Minh had paid a heavy price in casualties, but the porters and the bicycles and the Molotov trucks had delivered the supplies that made victory possible. The logistical system that the French had underestimated had proven its worth in the most conclusive way possible. It had won the war. The Geneva Accords were signed on July 20, 1954. The agreement divided Vietnam at the 17th parallel, with the Viet Minh controlling the north and the French-backed state of Vietnam controlling the south. The war was over. The French Union forces began their withdrawal from Tonkin, an operation codenamed Vorgen that required the evacuation of thousands of troops and hundreds of tons of equipment from a country that no longer welcomed their presence. The logistical challenge of the withdrawal was immense, but the French had learned to be efficient in their evacuations. Operation Auvergne proceeded through the summer of 1954. The French forces pulled back from their outposts in the Delta and concentrated at the ports of Haiphong and Hanoi. The equipment that could not be taken was destroyed or abandoned. The Vietnamese National Army assumed responsibility for the defense of the South, a task for which it was poorly prepared. The French Expeditionary Corps sailed for home, ending a 9-year struggle that had cost tens of thousands of lives and consumed enormous resources. The First Indochina War was over. The Viet Minh had demonstrated that a determined insurgency, supported by an efficient logistical system, could defeat a modern army. The porters who carried rice and ammunition on their backs had done what the French Air Force could not prevent. The Molotova trucks that ran the gauntlet of French air interdiction had kept the division supplied. The bicycles that carried hundreds of pounds each had moved more cargo than the C-47s could deliver. The lesson was not lost on the world. The era of colonial warfare was ending, and the era of people's wars was beginning. The men who had shaped the conflict carried its legacy into the years that followed. General de Lattre had not lived to see the fall of his line. He had died in Paris in January 1952, his cancer consuming him before the war reached its climax. Raoul Salan, who succeeded him, would be consumed by Algeria, his later career marked by rebellion against the government he had served. Roger Trinquier, whose commandos had harried the Viet Minh rear areas, saw his GCMA forces abandoned under the terms of the Geneva Accords. They were left to be hunted down by the enemy they had fought. Louis Berthéel, the planner who had designed the flawed concept of the fortified camp, watched from Hanoi as his assumptions were proven wrong by the determined efforts of the Viet Minh porters. Jean Gilles, the general who had commanded the initial parachute drop into Dien Bien Phu, understood that the trap he had helped spring was closing around the men he had led. Colonel Jean-Louis Nicot, whose warnings about the limits of air transport had been set aside, saw his prophecies fulfilled. The C-47s struggled to sustain a garrison that needed more than they could deliver. And Francis Brink, the American general whose desperate flight to Tokyo had saved the French artillery at Vinh Yen, had foreshadowed a deeper involvement. The United States would soon undertake that burden in this divided land. Each man carried the legacy of Dien Bien Phu. The French had been defeated not by a lack of courage or technology, but by a failure of logistics and intelligence. They had underestimated the enemy's ability to sustain forces far from their bases. They had overestimated their own ability to supply a distant garrison by air. They had assumed that the Viet Minh could not bring heavy artillery into the hills, and they had been wrong. The assumptions that had guided the planning of Operation Castor were proven false by the determined efforts of tens of thousands of porters who moved supplies over trails that did not appear on any French map. The Battle of Dien Bien Phu became a symbol of the triumph of will over technology. The Viet Minh had accomplished what many military experts had considered impossible. They had built a logistical network that could support a modern army in the middle of a jungle. They had moved artillery over mountains that were supposed to be impassable. They had fed and armed 40,000 troops for 2 months while under constant air attack. The primitive logistical system that the French had dismissed as inadequate had proven to be more resilient than the sophisticated air transport system that the French had relied upon. The war in Indochina ended with a whimper rather than a bang. The French troops who sailed from Haiphong in the autumn of 1954 left behind a country that was divided and a people who were exhausted. The Viet Minh had won their independence, but the cost was staggering. The country would not rest. The division at the 17th parallel would lead to another war, one that would draw in the United States and consume the next 2 decades. But that is another story. The story of the First Indochina War ended in the mud of Dien Bien Phu, where a garrison of 15,000 men surrendered to an army that had built its victory on the backs of porters. The legacy of the battle was not lost on the next generation of soldiers. The American advisors who served in Vietnam in the early 1960s studied the French experience. They understood the importance of air supply and the vulnerability of isolated bases. They understood the resilience of the Viet Minh logistical system. But understanding the lesson did not guarantee that they could avoid the same mistakes. The history of the First Indochina War is a cautionary tale about the limits of technology and the power of determination. It is a story that deserves to be remembered. The ports of Haiphong and Hanoi have changed since 1954. The airfields at Gia Lam and Cat Bai are quieter now. The hills of Dien Bien Phu are green again. The craters filled in, the bunkers overgrown. But the lessons remain. The story of the First Indochina War is not just a story of battles and generals, it is a story of supply lines and logistical planning, of porters and parachutes, of assumptions that were proven wrong by the hard facts of the ground. It is a story that continues to inform the way armies think about logistics and the way they think about war. The Battle of Dien Bien Phu remains one of the most significant military engagements of the 20th century. It marked the end of French colonial rule in Indochina and the beginning of a new era in Southeast Asia. The logistical lessons of the battle have been studied by military academies around the world. The image of the Viet Minh porter, carrying supplies over hundreds of miles of mountain trails, has become a symbol of the power of human endurance. The war was won not by the most advanced technology, but by the most determined people. Thank you for listening to this history of the First Indochina War. If you have personal stories or family connections to this conflict, please share them in the comments below. We would love to hear from you. If you found this documentary informative, please subscribe to the channel and give this video a like. Your support helps us continue to produce content like this. We are grateful for your time and your interest. Thank you again for watching, and we will see you in the next episode.